Last time on the WizardCast.
There we go.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Mark.
I see you once again. You're doing something that makes absolutely no sense. Ooh, nice distance. I realize I'm walking straight into our rather formulaic approach here, but may I ask what exactly are you doing?
Oh, well, you see, I've been isolated for just a long time. It's like I've been stranded on a deserted island.
Okay, and you're throwing glass bottles. Why?
Well, what else do you do when you're stuck on an island? You send messages in bottles. Humans are social animals, Mark. We need to communicate.
You know, Brian, you live smack dab in the middle of Wisconsin. You have to drive 30 minutes to even get to a lake.
Look, I'm throwing the bottles as hard as I can, Mark.
And now you all know why it's taken so long for us to put a new episode out.
And now the conclusion of the WizardCast.
I'm Brian Kwong.
And I'm Mark Ross.
We're Salesforce experts that love talking about technology and Salesforce.
We also love humor. Doesn't mean we're actually good at it.
In the Salesforce community, I'm known as the Salesforce Wizard, likely due to me wearing a wizard hat at Salesforce events.
And I'm known as Salesforce Yoda for pretty much the same reason.
You should see the ears.
We have a passion to help educate and entertain people.
So we've joined forces to create WizardCast.
We've got tips and best practices.
We talk with interesting people.
All mixed with quote-unquote jokes and humor.
Welcome
to the
WizardCast. It's been so hot out, I set up a little pool in the backyard.
No, I'm sure the kids probably enjoyed that.
They did, but it's so hot, it really heats up the water. I mean, you can just tell the pool is in the 80s.
Oh, I mean, how can you tell? Oh, I mean, yeah, you've probably got a pool thermometer.
Oh no, it's the leg warmers and the big hair that give it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Midwest Dreamin 2020. It's a new event for this year because, well, the world is different this year. But some things are still the same, as always, at Midwest Dreamin. I almost said Dreamin. I need to remember that. This is a little different. Things are still very much the same, even though they're very different. We have, as one of our fabulous keynote speakers this year for Midwest Dreamin, Mr. Peter Coffey. And, you know, it's a hard job for me to introduce Peter. He's very well known in this ecosystem. People know lots of things about him. People get excited to hear him speak. And it's like a challenge just to introduce him without saying anything other than, ladies and gentlemen, Peter Coffey. So we'll just do that.
Hey.
Thank you, Eric. And, you know, right back at you, because increasingly I'm finding that people tell stories about me that are about things that happen at a Midwest Dreamin event. We've got a number of high-profile contributors in the Salesforce community whose origin stories include their first public speaking appearance being at a Midwest Dreamin back when it was at Navy Pier, or being an opportunity to have people say, here's my winning raffle ticket, you use it to go get this seminar. And the events that have happened at Midwest Dreamin, the life-changing moments that I think the event has an extraordinary record of delivering really speak to it. And the fact that we refer to community-owned Salesforce Ohana gatherings as Dreamin-type events, you know, well, what more can you say, Eric? You defined the genre. And it is a global phenomenon that really took our own marketing team at Salesforce, I think, by surprise when they first grasped the breadth and strength of that kind of thing happening out there. It's wonderful to see. And in this time, when we rely so much on the ground game, as it were, of the people who are out there making Salesforce real to their served communities of whatever kind they may be. I can't thank you enough, Eric, for what you and the team that you've kept together over the last few years have done to make this an extraordinary differentiator for Salesforce as a company and for the Salesforce community as a community for so long. So, Eric, I'm really pleased that you were able to be part of what we're doing here this evening.
Well, thanks, Peter. And that does, of course, remind me of a story, a very brief story. And I believe it was Dreamforce 2016, I think, Peter, when you were kicking off the partner keynote and you were talking about these community-led events. And back that year, there were maybe 8 or 9 of them. And you specifically said something about Jean-Michel from French Touch Dreamin'. And then you mentioned me and Midwest Dreamin', and you said something along the lines of, they're just like a Salesforce World Tour, only Salesforce doesn't have to do a thing about them.
Yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool.
I probably still have that YouTube video saved somewhere.
Well, the chain reaction character of these events, where people come to one and say, I got to do this. And if 2 or 3 do that, and then 2 or 3 do that at theirs, and so on, you get a genuinely geometric progression of the number of these things. And the next thing you know, they're happening in Uruguay, or there are multiple events happening in a major city. And I don't know what it would be like to work for a company that had to drive all of that itself and didn't have the customers, frankly, challenging us. I mean, that is one of the things that makes a Dreamin' event so special, is that you aren't drinking our Kool-Aid. You're telling us what the next Kool-Aid flavor needs to be. And the degree to which I think I can say that doing 3 major releases a year at Salesforce is something that could easily become an exercise in, well, what clever things have the people in the labs come up with? And no, we really can say, look, these are driven by the demand of the people who are out there in the real world, making the Salesforce platform a medium of creation and mission success rather than just a technology product portfolio. And that's one of the reasons I'm now in my 14th year of what I really only thought would be an interesting 5-year gig when I started with the company in 2007.
And that ends our opening keynote. Eric lied. Everything's completely different because we that was the keynote. We have no sessions. Sorry. Yeah. Or the bait and switch. Apologize. Actually, no, I'm not. I don't apologize one bit. You should know better if you've been listening to our podcast this long. That
nothing we ever say is true.
Nothing we ever say. Yeah, absolutely not. But thank you, Peter. I think you are easily the most repeated guest we've ever had. It's always wonderful to have you here. And
yes,
I'm glad Eric can join us, and we're doing a little bit of the Midwest Dreamin' kind of spoof, because I think you were our first guest on our very first in-person live episode we ever did of the podcast.
Okay.
And I remember it very, very well. You were a wonderful person to have in the discussion, and we had terrible gags where we had some poor lady holding up signs to cue for applause and everything like that.
One. Yeah, I do remember that one. That was out at the Navy Pier. Yep. You were wearing the Wizard hat, which in a live event format works way better than it works in an audio podcast.
Especially because my Wizard hat doesn't fit over my headphones.
Well,
yes. Yes. So it's nice to be able to bring the party back together a little bit. When we were kind of passing back and forth in emails, one of the things we kind of talked about was how things have gotten different, considering we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and how there are lots of people who are now working from home. And sometimes I think I need to put the quotations around working for some of us who also have children at home and are trying to teach them at the same time. And then we have a whole group of people who don't have the ability to work at home. The folks out, some folks call essential workers because they have to be on site for healthcare, for groceries, all the people who are delivering. It really does seem that the labor force is completely different in 2020 than what we thought it was in 2019. And it does kind of bring me back to our previous conversation we had on the podcast, where we talked about how things were going to change with the increase of artificial intelligence and robotics and things like that. So my first question is, has your perspective changed on that? Now that we've had this kind of pivot to people working at home, do you see the position for artificial intelligence and robotics changing for people who are actively in the workforce?
The most useful comment on this is one that I've been quoting in every possible setting ever since I read it, which is when Joe Mckendrick, my good friend over at ZdNet, said, 2025 got here 60 months early. I think it's an error, and I do mean an error, not just a difference in point of view, an error to think of this as having been any kind of distraction or diversion or interruption, but rather to say this must be viewed as an acceleration of trends that were quite clearly underway. We've been talking with customers about digital transformation. I'll get back to that phrase in a moment because there are serious problems with that phrase. But the notion that we were going to incorporate ubiquitous access to mobile technology, appropriate support for human interaction with the consistent attention to detail and improvement of consistency of response that we can get with appropriate use of various forms of AI-derived technologies, that people were going to expect to be able to engage on their terms rather than anything resembling banker's hours or business hours, phrases that have quickly become quite archaic. And I think that if we view this as an acceleration of transformation visions, that I have yet to meet a single CIO who doesn't agree that there was a binder on the shelf of, the 2-year transformation plan, and now it's the 2-month transformation plan, or in some cases the 2-week delivery of these things. I think it's a much more useful way to look at it, certainly psychologically, a much more beneficial way to look at it, but I also think it's completely accurate to see it that way. And the other thing that it does is spotlight the degree to which statements that we were making literally 10 years ago, I could show you the slides, about the acceleration of development that's possible with cloud services and the degree to which a solution now can be owned by and controlled by the people who understand the problem best, instead of a specification being thrown over the wall to an IT department and you hope that what comes back 2 months later resembles what you thought you needed. I think these are now things that are not in any way speculative, but are being demonstrated again and again and again. One of my favorite examples is that when Bill Ford at Ford Motor was talking about the degree to which they'd been able to take manufacturing capacity and use it to produce ventilators for use in hospitals to deal with the pandemic during its most intense periods in places like New York. And he said something I thought tremendously insightful, which is there are companies that can make complex things in relatively small volume, and there are companies that can make things in large volume, but there are only relatively simple things. The number of organizations that can build a complex product at massive scale are small. And if you think of Ford as an automobile manufacturer, you can wonder, what are they doing building ventilators? But if you zoom out your view and say, what is the genuine distinctive competence of a Ford or a GM? It's the ability to build a complicated product in massive volume, subject to significant regulatory constraints. And when you start to think of competencies that way, you start to see your opportunity to contribute in an unfamiliar situation. But there's a second half of that story. A ventilator that's sitting on a shelf, 10,000 ventilators sitting in a warehouse. Those are not medical care. Those are pieces of hardware. Some of our people, many of you know one of the guys who works on my own team, Charlie Isaacs, some of the other people at Salesforce, a tiny handful of people, built, tested, put through security validation, and deployed on the App Exchange a ventilator management tool that now takes those pieces of hardware and turns them into things that you know where they are, have they been inspected, have they been tested, are they currently engaged in delivering care, and if not, where could they go, where they would be more useful. And this was done in 4 days. And I do mean 24-hour, terrestrial days, 96 hours. That is not something that I could have told people 10 years ago would happen without them laughing up their sleeves at me. And now we demonstrate that kind of thing every day before lunch. And that is so different about this one versus the financial crisis of 08-09 or the period after 9/11 when all the air travel was shut down. Someone said the difference is that this is the period of the calendar that is AB, after bandwidth, as opposed to BB, before bandwidth. And the difference of having tens of megabit per second capacity in people's hands and in people's homes, the difference in the quality of the technology that has enabled this kind of thing to happen and not be a poor substitute for what we had before, but a genuine improvement in so many ways. I've had people say this is the big difference is that someone in the UK, for example, said my 50 to 70-year-old customers are now using my online banking tools. It's not that the tools got suddenly better, is that they suddenly had the nudge they needed to get over the speed bump and leave their familiar modus operandi of visiting the office and talking to someone through a teller cage. And once they were pushed into this digital world, they found it was actually pretty nice. And that is why, in an enormous way, we've gone through a lot of one-way doors in the last few months, and people are not going to go back. And my friend Phil Wainwright over at the UK website Diginomica brought up a perfect quotation for this. There are decades when nothing seems to happen, but then there are weeks when decades happen. And that was Vladimir Lenin who said that. Oh. And he was kind of right. And the degree to which we've spent literally 20 years laying foundations of massively scalable computational capacity, ubiquitous bandwidth, comfort and familiarity with the use of mobile devices and mobile means of engagement. We've spent 20 years laying that foundation, with the result in a matter of a few short weeks, extraordinary changes in our manner of doing business, accomplishing functions of government, delivering with still work in progress success, delivering educational opportunity. These are things that happened in weeks that we spent decades making possible. And the result was an extraordinarily rapid change in actual behavior. And that's been really inspiring to see. And it makes me believe that what someone said the other day is that whether we get a vaccine this quarter or this year or not until next year, they made reference to the economist Joseph Schumpeter. The Schumpeterian creative destruction is happening and is going to happen. And we will look at the world a year or two from now, and we will still be seeing durable transformation of our belief that people should be able to access government services, access educational opportunity, work from where they need to work. And even the people who can't work from home, the field workers, what we are seeing, even though they can't work from home, is that there's a newfound respect for the idea that when the truck rolls, the first time it rolls should be the only time it needs to roll. That when people go out in the field, predictive diagnostics, remote telemetry and IoT capabilities, optimized shift scheduling, and other appropriate applications of technology should make sure that when we ask someone to take the risk of going out there into a possibly pathogen infested environment or other conditions, even if it's just a matter of climbing a pole for a utility worker, I think the degree to which there's a newfound respect for the idea that these people deserve the best technology support they can get. And I think that's great, because so much of this digital transformation has been about the needs of desk and office workers. And I think there's a newfound understanding of the intensity of the demand and the appropriateness of the investment in making it possible for people who are giving us the watts and the packets per second and the food on the grocery store shelves that allow us to be having this conversation right now. Now, I said something a moment ago about the phrase digital transformation. There are two things wrong with the phrase digital transformation. One of them is an adjective and one of them is a noun. When you say digital, it sounds like technology adoption is the challenge. And when you say transformation, it sounds like you go from level 0 to level 1. Both of those are badly flawed ways of thinking about this. The technology enables the transformation. It does not accomplish it. Dropping the technology into an organization that continues to behave in a siloed form or continues to behave in a we'll tell the customers what we'll do when we'll do it form does not achieve results. And the transformation does not take you from one level to another level. It takes you from a static behavior to a culture in which transformation is a continuous phenomenon and not an occasional big bang exercise. And that is far more of a challenge than merely introducing new technology. And the leadership challenges of building organizations that can be continuously transforming and that can adopt co-creation with their customers and genuine collaboration up, down, and across what used to be the silos of the organization. People talk about cloud as a democratizing force, and I correct them. It is not a force. It is a friction reducer, but it requires leadership to be the force. And what we are seeing is that there are places where that leadership is there, and there are other places where it is not. So if I'd had to do a conventional, keynote speech for Midwest Dreamin this year, I think these are some of the key points I would have made, is that transformation takes you into a new state of continuously transforming culture, that this is about acceleration, not about any kind of notion of this is a pause. If anything, we hit the pause button in March. You can't stay in pause indefinitely. You have to hit play and, if possible, get to fast forward. And the people who I'm talking to now are, I'm not going to say excited exactly, but they appreciate the opportunity that they have to be exercising the license they now have to undertake bold innovations that they might not have been able to achieve the political capital within their organizations to execute, absent this extraordinary situation, and that the results, I think, can have some extraordinary benefits that we will still be seeing years from now.
I really like that, Peter. And one of the things that, when you talked about how digital transformation was not exactly the right phrase or the way to think about it, one of the places that it's highlighted isn't actually work, it's in education. And this is something I would not have considered 4 years ago before my kids entered the school. But I have a child who's entering 4K, and I have 2 children who are entering 3rd grade. And what I've seen is a dramatic difference in school districts within the same area community. So, we're going virtual this quarter. The cities around me aren't. And one of the things that I've seen that is different is how the school districts are dealing with the technology that they can make available and how they're doing it. So we have our school district who's going out and saying, you don't have access to internet? Let us go get you a cellular hotspot so you can do it. I know another school district that is turning the bus system into a mobile hotspots for the rural community area, because you drive 15 minutes and you're in the country. And as we all know, we say ubiquitous, but internet is not truly ubiquitous when we start talking about outside of suburbia and urban areas. And so the areas that you see being successful with distance learning are the ones who are more willing to embrace and transform their own expectations.
And the repurposing of the infrastructure that you already own. I mean, to your point, turning the school buses into mobile hotspots. There are undoubtedly school districts in which that would be politically tremendously difficult to do, because you've got maybe a labor union in one place, or you've got some kind of regulation in another place, and there's something that prevents you from using the buses in that flexible way. We also have the remarkably convenient coincidence that we're having this conversation at just the moment when Elon Musk is launching hundreds of Starlink satellites, and the availability of broadband outside of city centers will be there. But education is a particularly important example, because it would be so easy to claim that you've achieved a digital transformation of education, even if all you did is what MIT has done over the last 2 decades, where now the modal time for consuming the lectures in the electrical engineering department is between midnight and 2 a.m. because they're all on video. And students are not using their precious daylight hours to go sit in the lecture hall. They're using their precious daylight hours to go do kendo practice out on the lawn outside Kresge Auditorium, and they'll listen to the lecture when they find it convenient to do so. And that looks sort of like a transformation, but I want to make people feel a sense that even that is timid and incremental compared to what a real transformation would be. And there's something that I found very useful from what Alvin Toffler wrote in Future Shock, which I was required to read back in 1973 as a middle school student. But he observed something really remarkable. And when I point this out to people, they look at me with this kind of dazed expression like they never saw this before. The classroom model of education that we treat as if it's the obvious and only way to do this was invented for the sole purpose of taking young people who'd grown up in rural environments on farms, where ever since they were old enough to hold a wrench, they'd been working side by side with adults and working in a creative, flexible, problem-solving kind of environment, and trained them to show up when the bell rings, sit where they're told, do what they're told, and go home when the bell rings. In other words, to condition them to be the factory workers that the transformation of the 19th century required. The notion that we are still treating that as the model, even when that is the last thing that companies say they need, is a sad example of a form of cultural inertia. Now, why did we have to do that? Well, even thanks to Gutenberg's invention of movable type and the ability to produce textbooks, we still needed to construct a thing called a syllabus. We still needed to construct a curriculum and put it between hard covers, because the delivery of a genuinely individualized sequence of topics and to have examinations actually detect and focus on the areas where an individual student seemed to need the most clarification and reinforcement, well, that wasn't feasible, but now it is. And now we actually could have a model where we return to a norm that as soon as you're old enough to, not mess your pants and feed yourself, you're placed into a real work environment where you do the next generation beyond what we call an internship opportunity, and where every night you sit down with your chatbot and it asks you questions about what you were doing that day, and it says, oh, okay, well, normally we wouldn't deal with chapter 13 of the book until a few weeks from now, but it seems like you need to read that tonight, and here are the exercises you'll be doing, which include some extra material that specifically focuses on what it looks like you have to be doing tomorrow afternoon. That is now eminently feasible. It's the kind of thing we could do with Marketing Cloud before lunch tomorrow. And the idea that we will genuinely reinvent the model of delivering education. Trailhead's been a start. Trailhead's been great because it's modular, self-paced, granular, gamified, has a lot of positives in terms of being able to deliver a micro moment of learning opportunity when you can focus on the thing you most need to know right now. And that's terrific. But imagine that model of content packaging and delivery placed in an intelligent superstructure of Einstein and chatbot aided guidance on what someone most ought to be consuming the next day. And now imagine we start doing that at age 6 or 7 instead of for mid-career and late-career professionals. Not that that hasn't been an amazing achievement. And when we look at the education of 10 years from now, or maybe even only 5 years from now, I'm quite optimistic that we will see the notion of a, quote, return to the classroom as being a badly flawed goal. The last thing we need is a return to the classroom. What we need is an acceleration into the future of making people creative, collaborative problem solvers with access to subject matter knowledge as needed, but taught critical thinking and problem-solving skills more than they are taught to regurgitate content.
There's a real sociological inertia as well as a cultural inertia there, because we're having to deal with all the concepts you're talking about, like the outcomes-based learning, like tying that directly in with artificial intelligence. Like those are amazing insights, but it requires a certain amount of discipline on the part of the learner. And in the absence of that, it requires a certain amount of absence. And it requires the parent. It requires a guardian to have that discipline, right?
Yeah.
And with the current status of things, this is exactly the pushback that we're seeing on this transformation. is we can't do that. We have to work. We can't oversee our children's education. So at what point does it become we don't care, this has to happen this way, or some other, like, what is that? There's a home transformation.
Mark, I appreciate you pointing it out, because the degree to which the norm has become the 2-income household as opposed to the 1-income household has been a thing. And there have been some really good books written on the degree to which, if you look at the standard of living that was considered an affluent middle-class home in 1950s America and compare it to today, the 2-car family became at some point a norm. The size of the home and so on grew, and there are plenty of people, especially on the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who will say this was a collaboration to create people whose demand for more material products in their lives would drive their readiness to be 2-income households, despite all the difficulties with that. I'm sure you've heard the acronym FIRE: financially independent, retire early. Families who don't build up from the bottom but work backwards from, okay, realistically, what would we need to be able to live comfortably and work backwards from there? They discover that you can actually live with a much smaller house, fewer cars, and fewer TVs. And I don't mean to minimize the very real challenge of dealing with families that have no cars, no TVs, and no home. And please don't think that I'm not dealing with that. In fact, the 501c3 and my wife, the 501c3 that my wife and I founded late last year has pivoted in a big way from dealing with issues of climate change, is what our original goal was, to putting most of our financial support this year into food insecurity, because that's by far the more immediate problem. At the same time, though, think about the transformation that we're talking about doing in terms of workspaces. We at Salesforce are very well known for some pretty conspicuous pieces of real estate. We don't own them, but our logo is on them. And the idea that you would come to these city centers, just like the idea that you would come to an academy or a school for learning, are pretty entrenched ideas. In the same way that I think many companies will find themselves not necessarily going to the work from home thing, but going to satellite offices. Instead of having a building in a city that's one company, what if I had 5 buildings in 5 cities which are shared among 5 companies? And people take advantage of certain economies of scale in terms of things like a mailroom and a cafeteria, but they're sharing a building with people who work for other organizations. And I think we can see a similar dispersion, not necessarily into learning from home, but into a smaller and more neighborhood local model in which children come together, but not in a way that's organized in what I'll call right now, the kind of political and infrastructure dominated model of the schools that we have now. I just see a lot of opportunities for not applying technology to preserve as much as we can of the way we've been doing it, but instead to say, given the availability of the technology and given the changing nature of the need, might there be a fundamentally different way to do it? And that's the kind of conversation I'd like to see happening, which is essentially to say, I agree with absolutely every single point Mark has made. I'm not rebutting you in any way. These are all absolutely necessary issues. The dimensions of not merely inequality, but inequity, because those are 2 subtly different concepts, are pretty darn important. It's been said that initially we talked about whether this was going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, or what some people call the Nike swoosh recovery, where it goes down very quickly and takes quite a long time to rebuild back up. But I heard a new term this week, which is that it's a K-shaped recovery. There's the vertical downstroke where everyone got hurt real bad, real quick, but some people are coming up on this stroke of the K, and those are the people who are able to take advantage of technology and work from home and Amazon Prime and whatever. But there's another stroke of the K, which is the people whose jobs are disappearing, maybe for good. Someone said in 08, 09, a recession is when the inventory is ahead of demand, and so everyone gets a 3-month involuntary layoff, but then you come back. But what we had in 08, 09 was not a recession, but a reset, and certain classes of job disappeared to a considerable degree. And the question now is, to what degree are we going to see another reset where categories of employment opportunity don't come back? I don't presume make any predictions on that. This actually is another key point that's been made. Some of you know the name of Peter Schwartz, who works with us at Salesforce. He's generally credited with having branded the concept of so-called scenario planning as opposed to traditional forecasting techniques back when he was at Shell. And his phrase that I quote all the time is, you must resist the urge to predict. Because once you've made a prediction and put some error bars on your prediction and now you have a forecast, well, maybe, but maybe something dramatically different happens. I mean, you don't need to have scenarios for what if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow. But we do need to have a scenario for what if there's no viable vaccine until next October. Not this October, next October. And being able to have multiple possible, maybe not probable, but plausible scenarios, all of which you've considered, none of which will take you out of the game, is a different mode of planning than traditional forecasting techniques have been. And I think it's one in which there's now renewed interest, and one which I'm finding our own customers tremendously interested in having conversations.
That K recovery. It does seem that's exactly what is happening, because you have what I'll call the distributed workforce, all the folks who can work from home or work in satellite areas. But then you have folks that are in the food industry and delivery services and healthcare services that basically have to go to a specific site to do their job. And if that site disappears or gets shut down or whatever the case may be, that's it. There's no place for them to go. And it does seem like those are the folks that, even though we as a society have been really dependent upon them to keep us going, are the ones that are probably going to feel the most disruption as we kind of progress through whatever you want to call our pandemic survival, hopefully.
Well, yeah, there are several ideas that are all packed into what you just talked about. And let me look at them in succession, if I may. Number one, many people have said that this is the first modern pandemic, and I feel that they're neglecting to give proper consideration to things like the SARS and MERS episodes in Asia. It's the first pandemic that managed to reach the shores of the U.S. in any kind of modern time. But the notion that pandemic is a new thing is a conceit that we're allowed to indulge ourselves in having here in the U.S. The degree to which places like South Korea have achieved literally on the order of 1/100th of the number of deaths per capita of the U.S. came from the fact that this was not their first rodeo. They know what these things look like, and they were prepared to act more swiftly with more conviction than I think we were. And in some ways, that's a hopeful sign. It means that the next time this happens, we won't be as slow to recognize the necessity of action. Yes, I saw the double-crossed fingers there. The comment about the workers who have to be there. I'm a native New York City child. I was born on Manhattan Island, and there were times when I was embarrassed to bring friends to visit New York City. But over the last 2 decades, I've really enjoyed bringing people there because it was becoming an example of a city that demonstrated why cities are a good thing, why cities work. People say, oh my gosh, the city, you're so far from nature. Yes, but if you look at the number of non-food calories consumed to put a food calorie on people's tables, the people who congratulate themselves for driving out into the country and going to the farmer's market, the number of non-food calories they burn to put a head of lettuce on their table compared to what my mother on the west side of Manhattan burns walking down the street to Trader Joe's to pick up a head of lettuce, which was one of 1,000 heads of lettuce that all came in on one truck. I mean, the efficiencies of urban life are remarkable. And back in the 1970s, Peter Goldmark, who's best known as generally credited with having been the inventor of the LP record, so that was a long time ago, but he did congressional testimony as part of a project for which he was the spearhead called the New Rural Society that looked in a very serious way in the 1970s, mind you, at the question of, does technology make it possible for people to make a more free personal choice between urban and rural life? And what was observed is that dispersing people into the countryside is difficult because in a city, you can have someone on a street corner who does shoe repair. You can have, you you can have a tremendous concentration of access to specialized services because the size of the market they can serve is big enough to keep them alive. And I think of the number I saw is that every one of those high-priced desk jobs in the New York City financial district or in the legal district or whatever supports 5 other jobs. And that math is difficult to move to a more dispersed, even suburb environment, let alone a rural environment. It's really difficult to do. And the stories about people who are out in the Hamptons, yes, well, they rely on literally helicopter delivery of their artisanal groceries from Manhattan. So these are not simple transformations to make. The math is difficult. There's a reason why cities work. And I don't subscribe to the idea that, well, this is the death of the city. The overwhelming efficiencies are unassailable, and frankly, the ecological footprint of taking people who are currently in a nice affluent and well-supported high-rise over on the West End in Manhattan and putting them all in single-family homes spread across the countryside, the planet can't handle it. The planet couldn't handle its present population if we were to disperse the city dwellers back to the countryside. There's a lot of things that I think are all tied together here. The relationship of public health, of economic opportunity, of climate change. It's really not possible to deal with any of these in isolation from the others.
So something that's happening right now is there's kind of a mass exodus happening from coastal cities.
Yes.
I live in Kansas City. Right now, the median market time for a house on the market in Kansas City is 5 days.
You have a whole 5 days. We're in 24-hour period.
That's what it was a few weeks ago. It might be lower now. And it's because people from New York City, they recognized what happened. When they got locked down, they're like, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. So they're all fleeing to these Midwest cities. They are moving to places with big open skies. They are moving to places where they're not as likely to have a major lockdown. This is affecting real estate prices, not just here in the Midwest, but also in the coastal cities where, you have these incredibly high costs of living for places like New York City and San Francisco, which are slowly dropping. And if the trend continues, we'll probably continue to do so. So my question is, now we have companies like Twitter and Slack who are saying everybody can work from home forever. The idea of this being required to be in a city from a work standpoint is not as much a requirement. What does that mean for these companies? And then I'll pivot it hard to Eric and say, what does that mean for, large group meetings like Midwest Dreamin'? Is Midwest Dreamin' when it's not necessarily just the Midwest?
Interesting question there. For the years that Midwest Dreamin' has been going on, we've been tracking demographics of who attends and where they come from. And it has been expanding the definition of Midwest every single year. I mean, the first year in 2011, when I held it in Louisville, Kentucky, I had 100 people show up, and it covered 5 states: Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and Illinois. And that was it. Pretty geographically the Midwest. When we brought the event to Chicago in 2014, that expanded all the way to the East Coast, including New York, North Carolina, Florida, and as far west as I think like Colorado. We may have had 1 or 2 people even from California come in and attend that year. And since that point in time, we've seen people attending as far away as the UK, India, Australia. So the Midwest is everywhere, if you want to think about it that way. It's an interesting thought, and considering we don't really know when events in person are going to be able to take place on a large scale again, all of these community-led events need to rethink what they're going to do, if they're going to survive, if they're going to just kind of hold it off and wait and see what happens. Some of them have done the virtual events already. And I mean, certainly me and my Midwest Dreamin' team have discussed that. And for 2020, we chose to basically do nothing and just let things happen. For 2021, we've already started the discussion of what happens if we can't have an in-person event. And our conundrum always comes around to how do you do a virtual event where you can still facilitate that random bumping into someone at the corner of a session and the keynote room? I mean, the happenstance of just running into somebody you didn't even know was at the event is very difficult to do in a virtual world.
The degree to which the conferencing platforms are recognizing and working hard to deliver a more human scale interaction is interesting to see. I've been struck by some of the research being done by some of the providers in which they've actually done brainwave scans of people engaged in what we're doing right now, for example, and found that the degree to which their brains are going into so-called theta wave state, which is traditionally associated with fight or flight scenarios, is pronounced and troubling because the human brain is not meant to be in fight or flight state for 8 hours of a working day. The observation was made by someone with the background to make this observation that when you think about it, when you're face to face with someone, it's typically preceding either fighting or mating, and neither of those is a low stress situation. And the idea that here we are with 40 faces in our face for an hour, 2 or 3 times a day, the human brain and hormone system are not ready for this. And constructing a visual milieu in which we can feel as if we're sitting around a table instead of looking at a Brady Bunch grid of faces in our face may have some really important impact on our ability just to handle this from a cognitive and behavioral and biological stress point of view. And I'm pleased to see that kind of work being done. It's also being done at places like MIT's Center for Collective Intelligence, which has been looking at this for a long time. The question about, well, what is the brand of an event if geographical proximity is no longer a thing, and if the chance to support and maybe even assist with AI-derived technologies, quasi-random associations and groups saying, hey, if you're willing to check this box, we will put you 10 minutes, we'll put 50-minute sessions with 10-minute buffers in between. Are you willing to be dropped into a breakout group of 5 to 6 people chosen based on algorithms of what questions were you asking? What pieces of the content does an eye pupil diameter scan show you were most interested in while the session was going on? And to what degree can the tools start to become bilateral and not broadcast in their orientation? There are ways that we can measure. Were you interested at this point of the presentation or not? Were you and 2 other people both suddenly Googling the same term when the speaker used it, suggesting a certain coincidence of interests? We can move it forward in this direction and actually construct platforms in which you aren't merely in the equivalent of a lecture hall, but now are all having a digital wingman at your elbow whose job is to look around the room and see who else is paying attention to the things that are interesting to you, and then assembling a birds of a feather session for 10 minutes at the end of every 50-minute session. I don't see that as requiring any new rocket science. That's something that can be delivered, and I'm confident will be delivered, because the competitive ferment going on among the Zooms, the Googles, the WebExes of the world is just on steroids at this time. And everyone is saying, oh my gosh, the opportunity really to break out and deliver tremendous value add is like nothing that genre of product has ever seen before.
I like that idea a lot better than what I was going to propose to Eric, which is back when the pandemic started, I pulled the trigger on something I've been coveting for a long time, which was a VR headset. Took 12 weeks to get it, but I've been looking at VR apps everywhere I can get, and one of the things I've seen starting to pop up is VR conferencing, where the people are building virtual reality sessions with the idea to make it feel like you are able to be at a conference or in the meeting hall or something like that. So you could, in theory, be virtually walking someplace and run into people. But I would much rather have more of an intelligence base to say, hey, Brian is interested in ABC. I happen to know Mark is interested in ABC.
Yes.
We should probably dump him into
this debate goes back to when Ted Nelson wrote Computer Lib and Dream Machines back in the 1970s. He said, the achievement of WYSIWYG and making our screens look like paper is a dubious achievement indeed, compared to building a system that doesn't limit us to the conventions of paper. And the example I offer to people is that when Tony Stark walks into his house, he doesn't go over to a touch screen and start, tapping buttons and filling in fields. Rather, the house says, "Oh, Mr. Stark, good evening. Would you like a new omelet, a new Iron Man suit, or should we instead be discussing the surface-to-air missile that's on its way into your living room window?"
That sounds like bad AI if it leaves the missile for last.
Yeah, well, the idea that we will expect systems to call our attention to that which needs it. Esther Dyson famously said, "Forget what Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon said about the definition of information. Information is that which consumes attention. And attention is the most finite resource there is. And anything that can reliably help me focus my attention where it's most useful and valuable to me to do that is tremendously important. And this is where the really interesting things are happening. For example, in the same way that programmers for years would say, I'm not going to use a high-level language. I need something that gives me low-level access to the metal, like C, not some high-level language. Well, more and more studies are showing that most people are delusional about their ability to write better code than an optimizing compiler for a language like Java or even Apex can write. And the idea that you're not as good as you'd like to think you are compared to what the best algorithms can do for you instead is finding ground in a lot of places. For example, the fastest street legal Porsche you can buy now is no longer even offered with a stick shift. Because if you're buying a car like that, you're buying it to get lap times on the rallies. And let's face it, the computer can shift faster than you can and can pick your shift points better. But even that really misses the point. What people may not realize is that the state-of-the-art driving systems in Rolls-Royce and Porsche these days don't merely make your shifts faster. They're using GPS to know whether what's around the curve is going to be an uphill or a downhill and picking your shifts accordingly. They're looking literally outside the box in which you're driving to look at the environment in which it's driving and make decisions that you could not possibly make unaided. They are wired into the larger environment, and they're not just applying the technology to do the local decision better. They are taking advantage of the computing and data fabric in which they live to make decisions unlike anything that an isolated node of computation ever could before. This is what the difference is between 5G and 4G, by the way. The Marcus Weldon at Bell Labs explained this to me beautifully over dinner once. He said, look, what we've had with networks and 2G and 3G and 4G, well, we've been turning up the bandwidth on what was still basically just a dumb connective tissue. And there are people like, Larry Lessig who said, well, that's the beauty of it, that's dumb connective tissue, and you can put all the intelligence at the endpoints and do things without the permission of the network. And that's an accurate point as far as it goes. But 5G is a computing fabric that, in its spare time, imitates the functions of what we used to call a network. And the degree to which 5G is a distributed computational environment and not just a data connectivity graph is really very, very interesting. The other example I often use is that if a Tesla driving down the street uses machine vision to detect a pothole and go around it, okay, some people will say, wow, that's really cool AI. A much less cool but much more interesting kind of AI is when the next Tesla that drives down the street doesn't need to detect the pothole because it already knows about it. Because the collective knowledge of all the Teslas now knows about that pothole and it knows where you are. In fact, I don't know if you've ever driven a vehicle whose front end rides low enough to the ground that it will scrape on a dropped credit card, let alone on a driveway ramp. And so now some of them have, little hydraulics in them to raise the nose. Both the new Corvette and the new Aston Martin have that wired to GPS so you can memorize the 20 or 30 spots where you want the nose to be raised without you reminding it. And that's just a small example of the degree to which this is a different orientation. This is not putting more and more computational power into individual nodes of machinery or individual people. This is about building constellations of knowledge augmented by prediction and learning algorithms so that the right thing happens more often with less human skill and attention being consumed in the process. So we can think about more interesting things.
Does that mean that the next Lightning design update is going to know what the user needs to see before they have to see it, so the admin doesn't have to build a page?
Well, we tried that with Clippy. You remember back when we got a lot of jokes out of the AI.
It looks like you're filling out an invoice.
Yes, exactly. But now, if you're using Gmail, I'm kind of struck by how often its suggested completion of my sentences is really what I was about to write.
Yep.
And the systems are, in fact, getting better, or at least becoming less conspicuously stupid. And I think we're getting better at writing systems that understand it's not their job to do your job for you. It is their job to make good guesses that are right more often than not, and whose wrong guesses don't get in your way as much. And I think we're just getting better at that. And that's something that some of the world's best talent is working on doing. And
Einstein's search is an example of that change. So maybe I should talk to Alexander Lovell and say, hey, can you apply Einstein's search to Lightning record pages?
Well, what you're also doing is bringing up a really key point. I recently introduced a number of people to a browser called Brave, whose stock in trade is that a huge number of things that browsers generally do to track your behavior, it by default does not do. And there have been two interesting reactions. Number one, when you go down with them the list of all the configuration options on Brave, their eyes get bigger and bigger and they say, Chrome is doing that? Firefox is doing that? Edge is doing that? The idea that you're turning these things off, they didn't really realize that they were on. But a simple act like beginning to type a URL in the field and having Google suggest the 8 most likely completions of that URL, I don't think people are conscious of the degree to which that implies that Google is watching over their shoulder with every keystroke they type. And when that's made manifest to them, they aren't generally happy about it. And that's a real question that is only gradually dawning on people, is the degree to which a lot of the things they think of as amazingly transparent conveniences are being paid for with the notion that there's an algorithm somewhere that people may or may not be monitoring what it does, that just knows things about you that you may or may not be comfortable having something now. An example of this, again, I'm indebted to Marcus Walden at Bell Labs for this one, is that consider the health rules that say your employer may not inquire about certain health conditions. Okay, fair enough. And yet, I can buy databases that show the anonymous movement of cell phones, and I can throw cheap computational power at these things to say, oh, this is interesting. Here's a cell phone. I don't know anything about who owns it, but it does appear to leave Peter's home address more or less every morning and go back to that home address more or less every evening. And every 2 weeks, this cell phone, about which I know absolutely nothing because it's anonymized data, also goes to a cancer clinic. Well, the ability to make certain inferences about my health from that data, no matter how, quote, anonymous, unquote, it may be, is apparent as soon as you point out that this could be done. And this is the thing that happens when you have ubiquitous connectivity, enormously cheap storage, abundant and inexpensive computational power, and algorithms capable of distilling massive quantities of data into powerful insights. And people say, oh, yeah, someone could figure that out about me. Now, when they say, well, the heck with that, I'm going to live off the grid. The best comment I've heard on that was someone who said, of course you can live off the grid. Of course you can do nothing but spend cash. Of course you can do that. No one will know you. No one will trust you. You will work harder to discover the existence of valuable services, and you will pay more for them once you find out about them. But if that's the choice you want to make, you can make that choice. And that is, and I don't mean to be flip about that. That is a choice that needs to be made for individuals, for families, for cultures. Now, how do you prevent us from having choices we want to make that are really no choice at all? Well, part of it is regulation. And I don't mean prescriptive regulation that limits innovation. I mean something as simple as look at the nutrition facts label on the side of a purchased food product. That doesn't limit what you're allowed to buy, but it does make certain requirements of disclosure of what you are buying. And this is something that I remember saying sometime back around in the late 1990s. I said, why don't we have the equivalent of a label that goes on a piece of software that says, when you are running this software, it will be using these internet ports, it will be sharing this kind of data with this external agent. And if you aren't comfortable with that, you need switches you can flip to turn things off and decide what you will and won't take, not an all or nothing kind of thing. And I'm really waiting to see a nutrition fact style labeling on digital technologies that tells you exactly what data you're sharing with whom and what they're able to do with it. And we're barely on the cusp of that now with things like GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act, which just last Friday passed a major threshold of control of what data can be accumulated about you and what privileges you'll have to review and correct it. And I see that as a positive step. I see that as the direction that we go forward. I do not believe that governments are capable of regulating this stuff effectively. It's been observed that every time a government tries to write a regulation against hacking, they criminalize routine administrative functions. And I just don't believe that prescriptive approaches can handle this. But I do believe that mandatory disclosure, mandatory transparencies are feasible. And I think that the market's behavior in taking advantage of that kind of transparency and disclosure is something on which we can rely.
Well, unfortunately, we're kind of coming up on time. We always love to have as lengthy a conversation as possible. We know it is. We don't want to burn your time and your schedule and your evenings. So, Peter and Eric, is there anything you'd like to share with our audiences before we sign off for the evening?
I think the one thought that occurred to me, Peter, while you were just talking, was a reminder of a story that I saw maybe a year and a half ago, where someone was getting lots of advertisements from Target in their email about baby products. And they did not know they were pregnant, but somehow Target figured it out.
Yes.
And told them they were pregnant, essentially. And the other little bit that came to my mind while you were talking was just the George Orwell concept of 1984 and Big Brother is watching, and how that scared people at one point in time.
Yeah.
I mean, and in reality, we have conversations like this at my house all the time, where our daughter is talking to my wife about a specific thing, and the next thing that happens is my wife pulls out her phone and goes into Facebook, and there's an ad about that very specific thing they just talked about.
Yeah.
Some people don't understand how that happens.
The Target story is especially interesting because, as you observed, the father came storming into Target saying, "How dare you send my teenage daughter baby-related stuff? Are you trying to encourage her to become pregnant?" And it turned out that, in fact, the daughter was pregnant. And the question, though, was, why has Target invested so much effort in being able to identify people who are about to have their first child? And it turned out that there was a very good reason for them to want to know that, because the moment when you become a parent for the first time is a moment when your propensity to change your shopping behavior to prefer one-stop convenience rather than shopping all over town for artisanal variation and best possible price is at a peak in your life. And if they can capture you as the customer at that specific moment of first-time parenthood, then that has payoff for decades to come. And that is a very human observation, which drove what might have seemed a very inhuman technology response. But of course, Target learned from this exercise, and now they aren't as blatant about it. The ads will still include baby-related products, but they'll throw in some gardening supplies and some auto parts just to make it less creepy and make it less obvious that they know this. Now, that some people say, oh, heck. So not only are they going to be snooping on me, but now they're going to be doing it with a subtlety that makes it less likely I'll notice. There's a mixed blessing for you.
All of which while they're trying to gain a customer for life.
Exactly so. And the degree to which the systems we build facilitate certain outcomes based on certain beliefs and what is important to people is one of the most human aspects of this. And I was just discussing this with someone earlier today. I said, do you remember when you turned on an Apple II or when you turned on one of the early IBM PCs, if it didn't have anything else that you were telling it to do, it popped up a basic language programming prompt. And literally the first thing the machine asked you was, what do you want me to do? And the initial mode of encounter with computational power was one of discovery, mastery, and control. And the systems that are sold today don't pop up with a programming prompt. If anything, they pop up by default with something more like a web browser. And so they pop up with a mode of turning you into an audience that can be sold. And these are choices. And these are cultural norms. And people like the people who showed up at Midwest Dreamin, who appreciate the beauty of an interaction based on discovery, mastery, and control, rather than one of being turned into a passive and sold audience, are important. And that is why, even though I have my reservations about teaching people to code when algorithms will do much of what code used to have to be written by people to do, still the teaching of programming to the young is an early imprinting on them of the idea that the machines are there to do what you tell them to do. And that's a value, I think, worth implanting at an early age. And Brian and Mark and Eric, the audiences that you've curated over the years may not realize the depth and power of their responsibility to take that value to people they know and to communities that they create. But it's among the most important attributes of a free society that people believe they have the power to understand and control instead of just being limited to making choices among which of several packaged offerings they're going to consume.
Otherwise, it just shuts them down automatically. If they are taught at a young age without anybody even realizing they're being taught that they should just be passive, then that's how they will remain.
Someone compared it to the movie WALL-E the other day, and that was an even more troubling comparison to than Brave New World or 1984 in some ways. But again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. The things that are wrong with the phrase digital transformation are the adjective and the noun. Digital is an enabler of taking control, it should not be a path of least resistance to giving it up. And transformation is an arrival at a state where you are seeking opportunities for constructive change, not merely congratulating yourself on achieving a new higher level and then sitting there for the next 10 years.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for attending our opening panel discussion closing keynote session. And thank you, Peter, and thank you, Eric, very much for joining. We always love having both of you on the show at any time.
It was such a pleasure to spend time with all of you. We should do this more often now that we're not spending time on airplanes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So true.
Welcome to the Peter Coffee every 3 episodes. WizardCast is produced by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, directed by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, technical administration by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, script writing by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, audio editing by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, maintenance by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, and our intern this episode with Jay Stumpf.
You can be an intern too. Just follow us at WizardCast_pod on Twitter.
Or if we ever end this pandemic, you can take pictures with us at various Salesforce events and post it on social media, and we'll add you to the list.
Have a joke, interview suggestion, or other comments? Let us know. You can call and leave a voice recording at 608-492-0321 or email wizardcast@thewizardnews.com.
And we're going to be doing these idea exchange highlight episodes. So if you have an idea you want us to talk about on the show, let us know.
Go to bit.ly/idea highlight to submit that idea to us.
Don't forget to subscribe to the WizardCast and receive our next episode automatically.
And please post reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice and share this episode. It helps others to hear what you just had to endure.
Once again, I'm Brian.
And I'm just now realizing Brian doesn't drink alcohol. So where did you get all those glass bottles exactly?
It's root beer.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's Sprecher root beer. It's kind of a mainstay.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, this was kind of an anticlimactic ending then. Dude, jeez! Aim to the left!
Thanks for listening.
I just want to say, I enjoy that joke a lot.
I was going to make some terrible comment about the fact that I wrote this joke back when we were having 90-degree weather, and then we stopped having 90-degree weather, so it didn't make any sense anymore, but now we're having it again.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, the heat wave's my fault.